Yes, sir. Very unruly, or very ruly crowd. That was good to be part of. Our next presenter is going to talk about physical sciences, the casual factors of natural disasters. Sarah is a PhD candidate, senior research associate in the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Lab at the University of Alberta. Sarah has a master's in science in the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences and a BA with a double major in human geography and design. I read that well, didn't I? Sarah's going to come and talk to us about the interdisciplinary scope and explores the broad theme of environmental resilience.
All right. Okay. So I'm just going to jump in. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I loved hearing all the responder. I don't get to do response. I do the stuff that happens before. So on that note, I'm here today. I'm going to talk about global scale planning and climate change risk reduction. So obviously I'm Sarah. I'm here today with my supervisor, Jeff Birchall, and we're representing the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Lab at the University of Alberta. Okay, so just a quick outline. First off, I kind of just want to talk about adaptation and kind of get into the nitty-gritty about it. So first off, I'm going to talk about kind of what planning is and what role it plays in disaster risk reduction. Then we're going to talk about the benefits of good adaptation and the risks that come with doing it poorly. Then obviously, we don't like taking any risks. So I want to talk about what adaptation needs to actually work and what we really need to be thinking about beforehand. And then lastly, I'm just going to quickly cover the concept of resilient development and how that factors into reducing our future risks. So before we get started, and I know this has already been brought up, climate change has already increased disaster risk. I really want to make sure we're all on the same page. As climate change worsens, there are widespread impacts. More frequent and intense extreme events are increasing disaster risk, even in Canada, particularly in the north. So in the future, this trend is going to continue whether or not we restrict warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Obviously, we've talked about funding already. This is really important. Climate impacts are extremely expensive, not just in terms of response. So obviously talking about these impacts is difficult. Economic analysis are still, we're still learning. But the most recent Canadian report suggested that by 2025, we're going to be losing per year in Canada, $125 billion. And by 2100, that's going to be looking at about $100 billion per year in losses. And so it's unfortunate because a lot of these costs, as we've kind of already touched on, are going to be paid by local governments and their residents. But of course, as it turns out, if we're thinking ahead of time and we're actually planning, then we can be preventing a lot of these losses. So that's where adaptation planning comes in. So what even really is planning? A lot of people aren't aware that this actually occurs. So planning is a technical and political process, and it's facilitated by planners like myself and Jeff, who we compile recommendations. And so this guides local level decision-making on things like land use or development and infrastructure. So we make recommendations and they're specific to each unique location. And we find these based off of technical data, and this might be environmental trends or economic trends. And then we do a lot of public engagement to kind of figure out what's going to work for the community. And this is really important when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And this is because infrastructure can take decades to change. And we really need to be thinking about these environmental conditions when we're actually making these planning decisions. All right, so planning plays a huge role, particularly as climate stressors are increasing. And so when we're thinking about a disaster, infrastructure is often the very first thing that's most severely impacted. And then it causes all kinds of disaster-related impacts for the community. And so when we're thinking about this, good planning is actually the thing that prevents, an environmental stressor from going from a minor impact to a full and outright disaster. And in fact, it's actually so important that thinking ahead now, we can save $15 in costs in disaster response if we spend $1 now on thinking ahead and adapting our infrastructure. All right, so how do you do that? Well, right now, we have two main aspects of adaptation that we use. There's hard adaptation and soft adaptation. And so I've tried to give an example here. I hope everyone can kind of see it. That is used for the same application, specifically coastline erosion. So highlighted in yellow, you can see hard adaptation. So these are structural measures and infrastructure upgrades intended on mitigating physical disaster risk. And so this example photo is actually a phenomenal Canadian example. This is Tuktoyaktuk, where erosion rates are some of the highest in the entire world. So what they're doing here is they're trying to control erosion through the use of riprap, which is hard concrete, and it's added to the shore to absorb the wave action and prevent erosion. However, on the other side, we have something called soft adaptation. And so these are non-structural ecosystem-based measures. So this can include restricting land use in hazardous areas or taking advantage of ecosystem services. And so the image here, you can actually see they've used a combined approach. So there's vegetation on a berm to prevent erosion, and then the buildings are a really good distance off, and there's some really good healthy marshland in between, so that if water does get over the berm, it is absorbed and it acts as a natural sponge. Well, it seems pretty simple, right? I find a lot of times it's like straightforward. As long as we're thinking about these things in our planning, then maybe it'll be okay. It's honestly not. So often adaptation is underestimated in its complexity. It ends up ineffective if we're not thinking about all the right things before it happens. And so there are a lot of risks and critical factors necessary to make it work that get missed during decision making. So I just want to talk about the benefits and risks of adaptation. So why is adaptation important? Well, obviously it reduces risk. We all know that planning ahead is generally a pretty good idea. So planning, well, climate change is already causing these increasingly frequent and severe events. We've talked about, floods, fires, heat waves, and this is causing all kinds of losses of lives and property, damaging critical infrastructure, and straining our capacity to respond. But adaptation ahead of time can reduce the magnitude of these effects. And as a result, it can mitigate the costs. Costs of disasters can be huge. There's human costs, but a lot of them are fiscal, and this might be infrastructure maintenance or response and recovery. And so adaptation helps us reduce these costs because it's preemptively, it's less expensive to prepare than to respond once things are an outright emergency. So we don't know exactly what we're going to face in our specific location. However, planning can really help us reduce these impacts. All right, so what are the benefits? Well, we have all these low risk, high benefit adaptation policies that communities can use to prepare for uncertainty, and it helps build capacity. So all these additional benefits are things like food and livelihood security, increases in health and well-being, or even biodiversity conservation. But the thing that I actually think is most important is this idea of uncertainty. And so I feel like it doesn't get quite enough attention. There's a lot of uncertainty in how we have modeled and predicted climate change and its impacts in specific areas. So it's really hard to know exactly what's going to happen. And this is really a complicated thing in the biosphere. There's all these positive feedback systems where you get a little bit of input and it really gets out of hand really fast. And so everyone might have noticed that the IPCC reports on disasters has become increasingly more urgent and the predictions more severe year over year. And this is because despite it being our very best possible prediction right now, we're really underestimating the actual impacts that we're going to face and the rate of change. And so this is really important to think about while we're adapting infrastructure, because just because we say, oh, well, our flood risk is going to be this high in 5 years, so we should be preparing for that. Often it's a lot shorter time span than we think. All right, so of course, despite this, there are all these risks and limits to adaptation. And so when we have unmitigated warming, it's already outpacing our ability to adapt. And so there are all these environmental limits. And so infrastructure can only prevent so much. We can only stop so much. And a lot of the human limits are what factors into this. And this might be financial or technical. It might be in our governance system. There might be all kinds of policy constraints. And so what happens when we come up against this ability to adapt? Well, we have maladaptation. And so despite our best intentions, sometimes adaptation measures cause these unintended negative consequences that actually increase risk and vulnerability rather than reducing it. Unfortunately, this is often an over-reliance on expensive engineered solutions that address only physical risk rather than the more holistic perspective of vulnerability. And this can create a feedback loop that amplifies risk rather than reducing it. So on the surface here, and I love this image, these flood walls look like they're doing a phenomenal job protecting their community. But underneath, it can actually worsen inequity and decrease future capacities to adapt. All right, so of course, we'd all like to avoid maladaptation. So I just kind of want to talk a bit about what we need to make adaptation actually work ahead of time. All right, so I just want to start a framework before I get into this section because it can get a little confusing. So what do communities actually need for adaptation? And it is shockingly not just a bunch of money. So the very first step is that we need to make sure that we're approaching the right thing or addressing the right thing specifically. The second is to make sure that we're using the right approach. And then the last thing is making sure that communities have all the right stuff to make this happen. All right, so the first thing is vulnerability. And so understanding vulnerability is the very first step of good adaptation. But vulnerability to climate change and disasters is often very misunderstood. And if we can't understand why a community is vulnerable, then we can't effectively help them adapt. And so understanding why vulnerability occurs in the first place is really important. So just to be clear, vulnerability, it's not a label that we can put on a specific group of people or location. It's actually a process that occurs. So when we have all these human, socioeconomic, and political systems interacting with the physical world, particularly when it comes to planning and decision-making around where infrastructure goes and how we address it, it can lead to increased physical risk or even unequal access to resources for certain people. And these factors can then perpetuate something called social stressors. And these are things like poverty and inequality, which then can further decrease the people's ability to cope and respond. All right, so on that front, there's basically two types of vulnerability. On one side, we've got physical vulnerability. And this is, you can see it highlighted in yellow here. It's exposure to hazards and it's physical risk. So this example here, there are beach homes and they are sitting right next to the ocean. And obviously as climate change worsens, we're looking at maybe sea level rise, coastline erosion, higher storm surges, greater wave action. And so all of these things increase the physical risk with specifically that location. But on the other hand, we have something called social vulnerability, and it's far more complicated. And it results from excess social stressors and environmental injustice issues that stem from the way that we do decision making. And so often marginalized groups are pushed toward high-risk areas, or they maybe lack access to public services, or they're not included in risk reduction decision making, or end up getting forgotten in the midst of an emergency. And so when we're thinking about climate change, it's really important to understand that risk reduction has to address both of these aspects. Because social vulnerability can actually hinder a group's ability to respond and cope during an actual event. Unfortunately, most adaptation measures that are done are simply just to address physical risk rather than addressing the more social measures. And this can lead to just a really patchy approach to adaptation that ends up failing, and then we see this struggle with response that gets overwhelming. All right, so on that front, vulnerability is unique. The human and physical systems, they're unique to each location, and vulnerability can vary drastically. And so this means that it requires a unique approach to addressing in that community. And this is really difficult as experts to come into a community and know exactly what's going to work for them. Often the best way to understand a community's vulnerability is to use a place-based approach and actually talk to the people in the community because they know best. The people who experience their vulnerability understand it the best and often know best what they actually need in order to respond. So in planning, we use a lot of this place-based approaches. In adaptation specifically, this means coordinating risk reduction through co-producing adaptation plans. And this is like through collaboration with communities. And And it's really the foundation of taking an equitable approach. So this means going out and talking to them through these participatory methods, getting some public input. Incidentally, this is actually one of the best ways to address vulnerability. By putting the decision-making power in the hands of those most vulnerable, it can actually help meet their specific and unique needs. Okay, so now we've kind of talked about like what we want to address, which is vulnerability, and how best to approach it, which is place-based methods. But that definitely isn't everything we need to adapt. So communities have to have, first and foremost, adaptive capacity in order to make this process work. And if they don't have adequate adaptive capacity, implementing adaptation and responding in the midst of a disaster is actually really, really difficult. Okay, so adaptive capacity means having a variety of resources and specific circumstances within the community to help them cope with change. And there are a lot of different definitions of adaptive capacity, but here I've used what I think is the simplest approach by Sinner et al. It's a wonderful Nature article, and I highly suggest reading it. Number one would be assets. And so these are the resources a community requires. Hold on. So it might be like money or technical expertise, things like public services. It can even be abstract things like healthcare or public transportation. The next would be flexibility. And so this means basically just not putting all your eggs in one basket when it comes to disaster risk reduction. And so it means having multiple adaptation approaches, fostering a diversified economy, and having a flexible governance structure that's able to respond on the fly. So the third is going to be social organizations. You can't have that flexibility without some sort of social organization. And I think it's the most difficult and yet the most important part of planning in general. When we're coping with the disasters, communities need cooperation and collective action in order to make this work. It has to be between the government and the community and within each sphere. So it's really important in the initial stages of adaptation beforehand when we're thinking about preparedness. Like I mentioned earlier, community involvement and knowledge sharing through those place-based approaches is often the best way to address adaptation planning. And so when we're talking about number 4, which is learning, living and managing uncertainty, we need to be able to cope and respond to change on the fly. And so our knowledge about climate change is constantly evolving, and communities and obviously their adaptation plans, they have to be able to respond to this. And so then the last is going to be agency. And so I think it's certainly not least, I think it's probably the most important factor. It means that communities have the power and the freedom to use their existing capacity to effectively adapt. All right, so this last section, I just want to quickly touch on resilience. I know it's a lot, and I just want to finish up on a more positive note. So what is resilient development? So climate resilient development is this idea that integrates adaptation measures, their enabling conditions, such as adaptive capacity, with mitigation measures and an equitable approach to sustainable development. It can really help avoid maladaptation, but I think like this is a little vague. So I've kind of created this framework a bit here. So what does this look like in real life? Well, we have 2 main parts. We have, on one hand, we have physical risk reduction. And so this is looking at soft and hard adaptation. And so whenever possible, adaptations, structural or, well, within the communities, they need to be soft adaptations. There's a lot less risk of maladaptation when you use these ecosystem-based or land use mitigation processes. And so this can also feed into this idea of ecosystem stewardship. So natural systems, if we're not disrupting them, they're far better able to absorb. When I was talking about the marshes acting as a natural sponge, they're far better able to respond to change than our human systems can. So the second here is going to be vulnerability reduction. And so this is where we're talking about adaptive capacity. And so this is really the foundation of good disaster risk reduction, is making sure communities have what they need beforehand. And so it helps them maintain the physical risk reduction measures like infrastructure measures over the long term. Maintenance is actually incredibly difficult and needs to be done well, or then when you have a disaster, things start to fall apart. Of course, it also factors into response because you need to be having all of those measures in place. And then lastly is going to be equity and justice. And so this is where we're talking about those place-based methods and approaches, working to reduce the social stressors through social programs. And this can, again, help foster adaptive capacity. And so this can help provide those solutions that actually can work for the whole community. And so remember how we talked about maladaptation and that patchy, fragile approach to adaptation? This system can really help. And so adaptation is something that needs to be strong and flexible and cohesive and thought about beforehand. All right, so in conclusion, I just have a couple key takeaways. Adaptation plays a really big role in disaster risk reduction, and it comes with all sorts of benefits and a lot of risks, like maladaptation. But effective adaptation requires a few specific things. We need to make sure that we're addressing vulnerability and using place-based approaches and making sure that communities have the capacity to implement measures. All right, so I like this quote. I think it really highlights the importance I feel in my own work. The cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. Any further delay in a concerted anticipatory global action in adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. All right, well, thank you so very much for sticking with me this morning. Again, my name is Sarah, and I'm here representing the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Lab at the U of A. And I'm happy to take anybody's questions.
I have a question, sir.
Sure.
You suggested we should need to focus on the right thing as the Edmonton United Services. Okay. United Services organization. Is there something we should be focusing on?
This is a good question. You know, when I'm listening to the previous speaker talk about, you know, this idea of like coming in after the fact and being called in after the fact, and this idea of a mandate for communities to be able to actually prepare these things. Obviously, you know, like you all don't have a whole lot of control over what communities are doing in the beforehand, but it's tricky, you know. I want to say that I wish that there was a mandate for communities to do adaptation ahead of time. There's not. And I think that would help reduce the reliance on external systems like the military in the midst of response, right? That they would have a better system to respond in the first place.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering, so we talk a lot about this, and and it's really good information, and I see it getting out to the EM practitioners, and this speaking about building resiliency in communities, and because we can't just dump money into response, and because it'll be never ending. We have to get ahead of this and build that piece into our community from the ground up. But do you have a picture? And my question is really, you know, has this level of education or research made it into the education and training programs for municipal planners and those career pathways of people that are in these positions making those decisions? Are they talking about this, or is it on EM practitioners to bridge that gap, or is there work being done, I guess, to try and expand that?
I mean, I think we're working pretty hard to try and teach planners about climate change and about adaptation. Not everyone comes from my background. But it's not required, which is unfortunate. But more than that, planners actually don't make the decisions. And so we actually just make recommendations to local decision makers, and then they get to make the decision about whether or not they take our recommendations. And so there's a lot of, you know, loops throughout the whole system that leads to this. And I think it's really unfortunate. You know, I actually, you know, I did a talk to somebody the other day who's saying, you know, like it doesn't matter if, you know, it's happening now or in 10 years or in 100 years. I'm the one that has to deal with it, you know. And he was in emergency management, and I find it so unfortunate that people who are dealing with it don't have that decision-making power. And that's kind of what I'm talking about, going back to these place-based approaches. And if we're talking to the people who are actually dealing with it, then we're better able to create, you know, a cohesive and resilient response plan. The problem is like, even planners don't have that power. We just make recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's where, and that's maybe where I see it on a smaller scale, where a lot of the approvals, though, and development permit approvals do happen within that planning department.
Mhm.
Maybe on the larger land use or structure plans, they provide those recommendations, but they're still building them, I guess, and presenting them to Peace. And you know, in emergency management, we can help support
Yes.
maybe some of that to reinforce that decision makers. But yeah, I'm just kind of curious. Yeah, what is the mandatory, or if it's getting into that sphere, or is that kind of what I have to maybe put more focus on, is offering continuing education pieces, or to go in and talk more to them about some of these risks.
Yeah, you know what? I think that's a great idea. I think, like, you know, when we offer courses like that on resilient cities, and we have people in emergency management come in, but it's often not something that people are thinking about, even as planners. It's not necessarily part of our, you know, education. It can be peripheral, but there's no mandate saying it needs to be thought about. There's recommendations it should be thought about, but there's nothing saying that it has to be done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one sec, we've got a question from Zoom here. Sarah, from online. What advice do you have for healthcare systems to practice climate adaptation?
That's a good one. I wish I was a health planner. I think, like, as health systems, it's really tricky. Resilience and infrastructure, obviously. Thinking ahead of time about, like, what would happen in a disaster, whether, you know, having, I don't know, you know, like, generators are effective. You know, I recently was learning about a place who was putting a new hospital on a floodplain. Don't do that. But as far as the system goes, I'm sorry, like, it's not really my specialty, it's health systems.
Thank you. I think that if your visuals there pointed to the Coquihalla flood disaster and the pandemic for the healthcare system, these things were overwhelming, and so that the incident itself is overwhelming, so the response is overwhelming, and the impact on our communities is overwhelming. So,
and this is the tricky part, is that it gets overwhelming so quickly, right? You know, you have some infrastructure fail, and then response is hard, and then, you know, you're struggling to recover, and the people, like you were talking about, the people doing response aren't able to make it there because their families are impacted, or they're stuck and can't get to work because the roads are washed out. And then, you know, the power goes out, and the hospital's, you know, at risk because it's next to the river, and it gets overwhelming really fast. And so I think the answer is always to have more than you think you need ahead of time.